If you need motivation to be disciplined, that already means you can and won't make it. And that's not an opinion, it's a psychological rule. Most people spend their entire lives trying to build discipline, when in reality they're just negotiating with their own mind every single day. And every internal negotiation ends the same way. The mind wins, and discipline loses. Here's what almost no one tells you. Every time you decide to see if today works, you've already decided to fail. Because discipline doesn't come from a decision. It comes from something much colder, much simpler, and much more inevitable. In the next few minutes, you'll understand why the most consistent people aren't more motivated, aren't stronger, and aren't more focused than you. They simply follow one specific mental rule that shuts down the internal debate before it even starts. That rule doesn't depend on energy, it doesn't depend on mood, it doesn't depend on willpower. And once you understand how it works, going back to relying on motivation becomes impossible. If you keep watching, you'll realize your biggest problem was never laziness or lack of discipline. It was giving your mind the right to choose. Topic 1. Why most people fail at discipline. Most people don't fail at discipline because of weak character. They fail because they're using the wrong mental model from the start. They were taught to believe that discipline is something you need to activate, feel, or force, as if it were an emotional switch that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Look at the common pattern. Someone wakes up with good intentions. They think about what they need to do, form a mental plan, and tell themselves, "Today I'm going to make it." But that sentence hides an invisible problem. It already assumes effort, resistance, and the possibility of failure. At that moment, the mind enters evaluation mode. It starts measuring the size of the task, the available energy, the discomfort involved, and the more it evaluates, the heavier the action feels. Not because the task is hard, but because the brain has been trained to treat discipline as an exception, not the default. What almost no one realizes is that the brain doesn't respond well to the idea of constant effort. It responds to energy efficiency. Anytime an action requires emotional convincing, the brain interprets it as optional, and anything optional becomes negotiable. That's why discipline mostly fails on ordinary days. Not on extremely hard days, but on normal days, when nothing is wrong and nothing is especially right. On those days, the mind asks, "Is it worth it right now?" And that question alone already weakens the action. At work, this shows up as quiet procrastination. The task is there, but there's a vague resistance that's hard to explain. In studying, it shows up as rationalized delay. After one more video, I'll start. In personal routines, it becomes postponed promises. Next week, I'll organize it. In all cases, the problem isn't laziness. It's mental architecture. Discipline was placed in the wrong category, the realm of emotion, motivation, and repeated decision-making. As long as discipline depends on a specific emotional state, it will be unstable by definition. Because emotions fluctuate, energy goes up and down, motivation disappears. And here's the uncomfortable truth that changes everything. The human mind was not designed to sustain consistency through daily conscious choice. It was designed to follow clear, predictable pattern without internal debate. As long as discipline is something you try to have, it will keep failing. But the moment you understand that the problem isn't strength, it's structure, you create space to fix the invisible mistake that keeps everything stuck. And that mistake sits exactly in how people were taught to deal with emotion when it comes to taking action, which takes us directly to the next point. Topic 2. The invisible mistake. Trying to feel discipline. There's a quiet mistake that destroys discipline before action even begins. It's so common it goes unnoticed because it feels logical. People believe they need to feel like doing something with eyes in order to act. That discipline depends on being in the right mental state. In practice, this creates constant waiting. The person wakes up and checks how they feel, tired, unmotivated, unfocused. So they conclude it's not a good moment to start and promise themselves they'll do it when they feel better. This pattern teaches the mind something dangerous, that emotion has authority over action, that acting is only allowed when the feeling approves. And once that lesson is learned, discipline becomes unreliable. The problem isn't having emotions. The problem is consulting them before acting. Every time you ask, "Do I feel like it?" you open the door to internal negotiation, and the mind, by nature, prefers to avoid discomfort. Notice what happens in those moments. Before the task even starts, the mind anticipates effort. It imagines fatigue, difficulty, frustration. That anticipation creates emotional resistance, not because of what's happening, but because of what might happen. That's how simple tasks start to feel heavy, not because they are hard, but because they've been surrounded by emotional expectation. The action hasn't even begun, and the mind is already tired. At work, this shows up as mental freezing. The person opens the computer, looks at the task, and immediately feels a weight. In studying, it shows up as escape disguised as rest. In personal routines, it becomes chronic postponement. All of this comes from the same place, trying to feel disciplined before acting. The truth is straightforward and uncomfortable. Emotion was never meant to sustain consistency. It fluctuates with sleep, food, stress, environment. Basing discipline on emotion is like building stability on sand. When you condition action on feeling, you train the mind to look for reasonable excuses not to act. And they're always available. There will always be enough tiredness, enough distraction, enough discomfort. That's why so many people say, "I know what I have to do, but I can't do it." They know, but they taught their mind that feelings have veto power. As long as discipline depends on emotion, it will be rare and inconsistent. It doesn't matter how many videos you watch, how many promises you make, or how many plans you create. The shift begins when you understand that action comes before feeling, not after. And to do that, you have to abandon the idea that discipline is something you feel and start seeing it as something you structure. That shift requires understanding a simple but decisive distinction: the difference between deciding to act and setting a rule that acts for you, and that's exactly what needs to become clear now. Topic 3. The difference between a decision and a mental rule. Most people believe discipline is the result of making good decisions every day, deciding to study, deciding to train, deciding to stay focused. The problem is that every decision consumes mental energy, even when it feels small. Every decision requires evaluation. Evaluation requires comparison. Comparison creates doubt, and doubt opens the door to internal negotiation. That's how discipline wears down before the day even ends. Watch how this plays out in real life. At the start of the day, someone decides they'll act differently. But as the hours pass, small choices appear. Now or later, just 5 more minutes, today or tomorrow. Each micro-decision drains available mental energy. By the time the most important moment of the day arrives, the mind is already tired of choosing. And mental fatigue doesn't show up as pain. It shows up as quiet quitting. The person doesn't feel like they failed. They just couldn't do it. A mental rule works in a completely different way. It doesn't require energy every day. It requires energy once when it's created. After that, it simply repeats. Think about rules you already follow without effort. You don't decide whether to stop at a red light. You don't negotiate whether to pay for something you bought. Those actions don't pass through emotion. They've already been classified as automatic. When something is a rule, the mind doesn't ask, "And do I want to?" It just recognizes, this is how it works. There's no debate. And where there's no debate, there's no drain. This is the line that separates consistent people from inconsistent ones. It's not moral discipline. It's not willpower. It's ein mental design. Inconsistent people live in a system built on decisions. Consistent people live in a system built on rules. A decision has to be made again every day. A rule only has to be followed. As long as studying, focused work, or personal routines remain daily decisions, they'll keep competing with mood, fatigue, and distraction. But when they're turned into simple, clear rules, they leave the emotional arena. That's when something quietly shifts. Discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like normal. Not because it became easy, but because it stopped being debated. And here's the real turning point. Discipline doesn't get stronger when you decide better. It becomes inevitable when you too stop deciding. From here, one question becomes unavoidable. If rules have this kind of power, what exactly is the rule that eliminates internal negotiation and makes discipline happen almost automatically? That's what needs to be revealed next. Topic 4. The rule that makes discipline automatic. There's a simple mental rule that completely changes how the mind relates to effort. It's not motivational, it's not inspiring, but it's extremely effective. The rule is this: if something is a rule, it isn't debated. If it's a choice, it gets negotiated. That's exactly how the human mind works. Anything it classifies as a choice requires evaluation. Anything it classifies as a rule requires obedience consumes less energy than decision-making. Notice how this already plays out in your life. You don't wake up evaluating whether you'll brush your teeth. You don't analyze your motivation level before getting dressed to go out. Those actions don't pass through emotion because, internally, they've already been labeled as non-negotiable. Now compare that to what you call discipline, studying, training, focused work, taking care of your routine. These actions still live in the category of choice. And as long as something stays there, the mind feels entitled to ask, do I really need to today? Is now the best moment? Can't I just delay it a little? The mistake most people make is trying to convince the mind to act. They use arguments, promises, emotional rewards, but the mind doesn't respond well to constant persuasion. It responds to classification. When an action is reclassified as a rule, something shifts quietly. The mind stops producing anticipatory resistance, not because the task became pleasant, but because it stopped being optional. This is important to understand precisely. A rule doesn't need to be big, heroic, or extreme. It needs to be clear and consistent. Rules fail when they're vague. They work when they're specific. For example, I'll study when I can is a choice. Every day at 8 p.m. I start as a rule. I'll try to focus more at work is a choice. From 9 to 10, notifications off is a rule. Feel the difference. The rule doesn't ask how you're feeling. It defines what happens when the situation shows up. It removes the space where the mind usually sabotages. Here's something few people notice. Emotional resistance decreases. After. The rule is in place, not before. People wait to feel ready in order to be consistent. But consistency is what creates mental stability, not the other way around. When you turn an action into a rule, the mind realizes that debating costs more energy than executing. And since the brain always looks for efficiency, it chooses the shortest path: action. That's why trying to force yourself never works for long. Forcing is fighting the mind. Creating rules is aligning the mind with a fixed pattern. Discipline becomes automatic not because you got stronger, but because the structure became clearer. The mind isn't cooperating, it's obeying a system that leaves no room for bargaining. From here, an inevitable question arises. Why does the brain accept rules so easily and resist repeated decisions so strongly? The answer isn't philosophical, it's neurological and practical. And understanding it is what locks discipline in place without emotional effort. Topic 5. How the brain responds to fixed rules. The human brain wasn't designed to decide all the time. It was designed to save energy. Whenever possible, it turns decisions into automatic patterns, because that reduces cognitive effort and emotional wear. When something is left open-ended, the brain enters monitoring mode. It evaluates risks, compares alternatives, anticipates discomfort. That process consumes energy even when no action happens. That's why thinking about doing something is often more exhausting than doing it. Fixed rules completely change this dynamic. They shut down the evaluation process before it even starts. The brain understands there's no fork in the road, no alternative, no calculation to make. There's only execution. This is the same mechanism that lets you drive without thinking about every movement, or follow work procedures without internal debate. The pattern has already been learned. The cost of questioning is higher than the cost of following. When you create a clear rule, time, condition, defined start, the brain starts treating that action as part of the environment, not a personal choice. And that's decisive, because the brain doesn't argue with the environment. It adapts to it. What happens for most people is the opposite. They leave important actions in an ambiguous space. Sometimes they do them, sometimes they don't. That constant maybe prevents the brain from automating anything. Every time you break a rule that should be fixed, the brain learns something dangerous, that the action isn't truly mandatory. And next time, resistance shows up earlier and stronger. On the other hand, when a rule is simple and respected even on bad days, the brain starts accepting it as part of life's structure. Not because you enjoy it, but because it became predictable. This is where discipline changes its nature. It stops being an internal battle and becomes a natural sequence of events. The time arrives. The action starts. No drama. That's why consistent people seem like they don't think before acting. They think less because they already thought earlier, when they created the rule. The energy that used to be spent on negotiation is now preserved for execution. Discipline isn't insistence. It's repetition without emotion. It's doing the work on ordinary, neutral days with no special stimulus. And it's precisely that neutrality that teaches the brain to stop resisting. When the brain realizes that arguing doesn't change the outcome, it stops arguing. And when the argument ends, discipline shows up as a consequence. All of this sets the stage for the final step: how to turn this understanding into practical rules that survive real life, without excessive rigidity and without collapsing after the first slip. That's exactly what needs to be anchored now. Topic 6. How to install this rule into daily life. This is where most people make their final mistake. They understand the logic of the rule and immediately try to create something too big, too rigid, too heavy. They turn structure into a prison. And when they fail once, they abandon everything. Installing a mental rule isn't about creating a perfect system. It's about creating a system simple enough to survive bad days. Because real discipline isn't tested on good days. It's tested on ordinary days and tired days. The first principle is this: the rule is about starting, not intensity. Most people try to control duration, performance, results. That pushes the action back into negotiation. Instead of "I'll study 2 hours every day and whine," the functional rule is, every day I start, even if it's short, even if it's imperfect. The start is fixed. Everything else adjusts. The brain respects the start when it's non-negotiable. And once the start happens, the rest usually follows with less resistance. Not because of motivation, but because the body is already in motion. At work, the same principle applies. It's not, "I'll be productive today." That's too vague. The correct rule is situational. At this time, I enter focus mode. No mood check, no day analysis. The time arrives, the action begins. Notice the pattern. The rule always answers the question, "What happens when X occurs?" Never the question, "How do I feel right now?" In personal routines, rules act like anchors. Going to bed at the same time, organizing the next day before ending the night. Doing one small daily act of self-care, not to be productive, but to teach the mind that your stable patterns exist. Another essential point: a rule only works if it's specific. "I'll be more disciplined" means nothing to the brain. Every day, after coffee, I do X means everything. The less room for interpretation, the less room for sabotage. And here's the detail that prevents excessive rigidity. The rule governs the start you, not performance. You don't need to be excellent. You need to show up. Excellence comes later. Consistency comes from structure. When a rule is followed even on neutral days, the brain starts accepting it as part of identity. Not something you're trying to do, but something that simply happens. That's when discipline changes how it feels. It stops feeling like conscious effort and starts feeling normal. No euphoria, no drama, just stability. And maybe the most important point of all, when you fail, you don't renegotiate the rule. You simply return to it in the next cycle. No punishment, no emotional storyline, no turning a slip into a collapse. Inevitable discipline isn't born from absolute control. It's born from fast return to structure, always. When the mind learns that the rule still exists regardless of mood or yesterday's performance, it stops testing boundaries. And when the tests stop, discipline installs itself naturally. Now that the structure is clear, what's left isn't learning something new, but looking at your own life and noticing what's still open to negotiation for no real reason. That's what needs to be closed in the conclusion. When discipline stops being a choice, inevitable discipline isn't about pushing harder. It's about removing the mind's permission to negotiate what truly matters. The moment an action stops being a daily choice, it stops competing with mood, fatigue, and distraction. Most people aren't exhausted because they do too much, but because they decide too much. They decide whether to start. They decide whether to continue. They decide whether today is worth it. Each repeated decision drains the mind, and that drain gets mistaken for lack of discipline. When you understand that discipline doesn't come from emotion or motivation or willpower, but from structure, something reorganizes internally. You stop waiting for the right mental state. You stop arguing with yourself. You stop turning simple actions into internal battles. The mind learns that certain things just happen. The question now isn't theoretical. It's practical and direct. What in your life is still open to negotiation when it shouldn't be? Where do you still ask? Maybe today, when the answer should already be decided. Don't try to change everything. That would throw the problem back into emotion. Choose one essential action. Remove it from internal debate. Turn it into a simple, clear, repeatable rule, and watch the quiet effect this has over time. Real discipline doesn't create excitement. It creates stability. It doesn't demand attention. It organizes life beneath the surface. If this video helped you see discipline more clearly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The goal here isn't to hype you up or pressure you. It's to teach you to think more precisely, act with less noise, and build a firm mind in an unstable world. Because when the mind stops negotiating with what's essential, discipline stops being a daily fight and becomes simply the way you live. In the next video, you'll understand the silent habit mentally strong people practice every day, without announcing it, without posting it, without needing validation. It's a simple, almost invisible behavior, but one that creates massive psychological advantage over time. If you want to keep strengthening your mind with less noise and more precision, this next step is essential: the silent habit of mentally strong people.